Hello and welcome to Unstressed. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, today we are exploring workplace wellness and we're looking at burnout and we're looking at some solutions to those burnouts. And my guest, well, she's back after I've already spoken to our guest, Dr. Suzy Green, on previous occasions. We explored the Positivity Institute and her work there and her book that she's written on that very subject. Suzy it's just wonderful to have her back. I always enjoy talking to her. As a clinical psychologist with extensive experience in the treatment of mental illness, Suzy's on a mission to reduce the impact of mental health in our workplace, in our schools, and in our communities. As a clinical psychologist who has scientifically investigated the impact of evidence-based coaching, Suzy's also committed to encouraging the use of coaching for performance and well-being enhancement for all. Her extensive experience in the media includes having been a brand ambassador for ANZ, for Fitbit, for Nivea, for Nespresso, for Officeworks. When you speak to Suzy, you'll see exactly why she would be such an ambassador. She's also an official ambassador for the Starlight Children's Foundation and regularly speaks at both keynote and on-panel presentations about positive psychology. Now, positive psychology is something that I have been aware of over the last 10 years. It was actually the subject in one of the chapters on my book. I've been aware of the work of Professor Martin Seligman, or as Suzy calls him, Marty Seligman, who is a world leader in wellness, but in positive psychology. And she references the PERMA model, PERMA. And we go into what that actually means. Look, I just love the quote, of the mission, if you like, of Suzy's work, and that is to create a flourishing world. How's this for a quote to inspire you? We help the world to flourish by creating meaningful and sustainable positive change. We're internationally recognized world leaders in applying cutting-edge scientific research to sustainably improve well-being and performance. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Suzy Green. Welcome back, Suzy.
Really pleased to be here, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Suzy, the workplace has been a major it is always a major focus, but the last 2 years has been a particularly focused time, and people are reflecting on their workspace and the health of their workforce and what they're doing. When we look at a workplace, how do we define, say, poor health in a workplace?
Yeah, it's interesting, Ron. I tend to look at what we can do to create really flourishing workplaces, which I'm sure we're going to get to
Yeah,
today. But I
absolutely.
think most of us sort of, whether it's intuitively or have experienced what it's like to be in a workplace that doesn't lead to excellent or even good health outcomes, whether that's physical or mental health. But increasingly, we're recognizing that it is the design of the workplace, the culture of the workplace, the leadership, the so many different what we would refer to as psychosocial hazards or psychosocial factors that affect our health and well-being. And whilst I'm absolutely for giving people all the skills and take some personal responsibility for our health and well-being, I think it's a really important acknowledgement that through COVID is increasingly being made that the workplace can either support our well-being, or it can actively undermine both our health and well-being.
I mean, when we think that we spend a third of our lives usually, and that's an optimistic estimate for some people, they spend more than a third of their
That's
lives
right.
working. It's quite a responsibility on the part of the workplace to get involved in that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And look, there's been laws globally and in Australia for what we might call work health and safety or occupational health and safety for a long time. But more recently, there's been some rapid evolution, which started with the release of a global or an international standard, which is ISO, International Standard ISO 45003, which sits under another standard, ISO 45001, which is occupational health and safety. But this new one is specifically looking at psychological health and safety in the workplace because, and I can't quite quote the stats, but and they do vary a little bit globally, but we know that increasingly, particularly stress related workers' compensation claims, they're the majority of claims. There's been a real move from physical claims to psychological claims, and so there is a recognition that there's a shared responsibility for workplace physical and mental health um, by the organisation and by the individual.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the word stress, which of course is a major focus of this podcast, and
Absolutely.
and it's interesting because we spoke to a CEO, a former CEO recently, who identified workers' compensation premiums as a major driver in pushing corporations to take their health of the workforce seriously.
I know. And look, I think we need both the carrot and the stick, if you like. And I think having legislation and I think I'll just alert people to it is differs from state to state here in Australia at the moment, but we're going to see a lot more around that. So companies will be held, legally, and they already are in terms of broader health and safety. But as I said, there's going to be much more specific focus on this psychological health and safety. But we really, ideally, it's the good and noble thing to do. Really, is to create workplaces where people have the opportunity to flourish, to be their best selves, and in my, I guess, idealistic world, Ron, to self-actualize, that they can be places where people truly can become the best version of themselves.
Yes. Well, I suppose it may be early in our discussion to talk about the meaning of life, but I've always thought fulfilling your potential was a good thing to aim for, whatever that means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, we've got lots of research in psychology and organizational psychology on the impact of high rates of job satisfaction and engagement on productivity, reduced absenteeism, reduced presenteeism. So we've got a pretty strong business case. And I think, as you said, COVID has really accelerated people's awareness of particularly mental health and the need to be much more proactive. And that, as I said before, means taking a good hard look at your systems, your policies, your procedures. Are they actively supporting or undermining well-being? And also, from my perspective, which is really our sweet spot at the Positivity Institute, is how can we promote flourishing through giving people the psychological skills which historically they wouldn't have learned until they did really suffer and went to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So trying to equip people much more proactively so that when these challenges come, they're better equipped. And as you know, Ron, a part of our work is in schools, and we are seeing, an increased uptake of, and it's not just the independent schools now, in public schools, children being taught these well-being skills and building what's being increasingly referred to as well-being literacy, which is a term that's being researched down at the University of Melbourne in the Centre for Wellbeing Science.
Wow, that is so encouraging because some of the statistics that I'm hearing coming out of well, youth, but in general in the population. I mean, I was going to ask about burnout because burnout is a big topic, and I think an
Absolutely.
opportunity to reflect on. A lot of people would say, "Hey, maybe I'm suffering from burnout." We hear the word a lot. What is it, and how common is it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The term did exist prior to COVID, but I think there's been numerous factors that most of us are aware of that have heightened the chances of experiencing burnout. I was really fortunate to hear the key researcher in this space, Christine Maslach, speak at the Institute of Coaching over at Harvard a number of years ago now, which it was one of those sort of, moments when you think, wow, I've read all of her work, and she really has been the pioneer in this space.
Hmm.
And she originally, I guess, just to get it, to keep it really simple, it's just the adverse consequences of being in a work environment that has a negative impact on your health and well-being, but it's particularly prolonged exposure to stress. Because as you know, this is your area of expertise, Rod, we can have good stress and not so good stress, but this is prolonged chronic experiencing prolonged chronic stress, and often in response to stressors in the environment. Um, so then she found in her research three key components that make up burnout were this sense of exhaustion, which and I just listened to a podcast recently about burnout, and the researcher was saying that a lot of people think because they're feeling emotionally drained that they have burnout, but that's not the you know, full definition of it. You have to also have this sense of cynicism, or a
Mm.
disengagement, and you become quite cynical about your work. And you can also have this sense of ineffectiveness, that am I really making a difference here? Am I really, am I achieving anything? So I guess a lowered sense of competence as well. So it's a big one. And I again did a bit of research leading up to today. Couldn't find any really rigorous studies here in Australia, but there's been lots and lots of workplace reports done, and they vary from 1 in 2 people, 1 in 3 people, 1 in 5 people reporting symptoms of burnout. So it's a hot topic right now.
It's so interesting to hear you include those three because, I can imagine the people just associating exhaustion with one,
That's right.
but disengagement and ineffectiveness tap so into the work that you do, with the positivity, and we're going to talk about that.
Yes.
But what are some of the long-term impacts of that on a person? How do they manifest themselves?
Well, I think, and I'm not entirely sure of the research on this, but I guess from my experience as a clinical psych, these particularly the increase of negative emotional affect. And again, I actually just found another study this morning showing with burnout that there's definitely reduced positive affect, which makes sense. So you're not
Mm.
experiencing much positive emotionality and lots of negative emotionality. And as you would know, over time that could become subclinical depression or even lead to clinical depression. um, but there, other outcomes can be increased uptake of alcohol, and we saw a lot of that in COVID, didn't we? Where people were sort of turning to alcohol to relieve some of the stress that they were experiencing. And there's a lot of physical health, like high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes. So there are a range of outcomes. And I know when I first looked at the research on stress when COVID hit, decades and decades of research on stress. And again, you'd probably know more to this than me on our physical health. So we know that, again, prolonged exposure to stress has a detrimental effect on our physical health through our
Mm.
immune system. But thankfully, and increasingly, we're getting research to show that improved or enhanced positive emotions can have a buffering effect for our immune system as well. So, which is why we try to, and it's not toxic positivity by any means, but there's a real business case, and I guess a health case to actively and intentionally trying to create a little bit more joy and positivity in our lives for our physical health, not
Mm.
as well as our mental health.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, obviously, stress has been a major focus for me over many years, and I've kind of extended this definition of stress as being anything that compromises immune function and promotes
Right.
chronic inflammation.
Right.
Because that's not just, I mean, there's a much broader definition of stress,
Yes,
and we want to try and pick and identify and reduce in as many different areas as we can.
that's it.
I know this is an overused word, but to build resilience
Yes.
back into our systems.
Absolutely, but I think it's so wonderful that through the work that you do as well, it's the education, because I don't think people, well, at least in my experience, the majority of people don't understand that link between our emotions and our immune system and then our physical health,
Hmm.
And actually, I went to my GP recently, and she said that people are often hesitant to even consider that it's just that it's stress. It's got to be, they focus very much on the physical symptom, and that
Hmm.
there's something physical that needs to be fixed rather than recognizing that there might be something emotional going on. And of course, that can be a reflection of the environment that we're in, not just trying to blame the individual for not coping or not being resilient enough. But I think, guess coming back to my earlier point, there's such a much greater focus on the environments that we're in and whether they are much like plants. If it's getting enough sun and water, then it experiences the heliotropic effect. All living things move towards that which energizes them, and move away from that which depletes our energy. Just similarly to plants, we're the same. We move towards that which is energizing, and we move away from that which is de-energizing.
What a beautiful metaphor. I love that.
Yes, and
'Cause yeah, I really do.
it's used in positive organizational scholarship at the Ross School of Business, and Professor Kim Cameron talks about organizations that are, I guess, obeying, or that we're really trying to create the heliotropic effect in positive organizations.
Because what's when people come at work and are stressed, what and they're feeling burnout, what's available currently now as a sort of a standard
Yeah.
approach?
Interesting. And just before I came on this morning, an HR update came through on the role of the CEO in mental health and wellbeing in the workplace. And I think the stats were that 80% of the top 500 businesses in Australia have an EAP, an employee assistance program, but less than 5% of people in terms of uptake are utilizing them. And I'm not sure that was just one study, and that could not be, because as I said, it just flashed up just before I came on. But I speak to a lot of HR directors, and unfortunately, even though I think the stigma is reducing and things are changing, there's still some hesitancy about using EAP. Sometimes you only get 3 or maybe 6 sessions, and if it's something that has been going on a long time, you may not resolve it in 6 sessions. And you're probably aware that the government extended the mental health referral scheme to, I think, up to
10, I think it
10
is 10
sessions
sessions, yeah.
now, because we may not address all those issues in 6 sessions. And I've heard people in the workplace say to me, well, what's the point? I'll go to EAP and then I only get 6 sessions, and then I've got to go and get a referral from my GP, and then I have to tell the whole story again. So I think I absolutely think EAP is a non-negotiable, and really, and it's a wonderful service for people to have. But I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of increasing uptake and making it, I guess, a better solution in the workplace.
The P in EAP stands for
Provider, I think, because I was thinking
employee assisted, because that P,
program or provider. Yeah.
yeah, because I think that P has great potential.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And ideally, I spoke at the National EAP conference a number of years ago now on the benefits of coaching, which, as you know, is my background as
Mm.
a proactive mental health and wellbeing strategy. And some of the EAP providers told me that they do make coaching available as part of their broader service. But I guess my argument would be most psychologists haven't been trained in coaching methodologies as such, and so I think there's definite opportunity for whether you're a counsellor or a social worker or a psychologist to learn more of these proactive to help people move into the future, not just resolve the issues of the past.
Hmm. And I mean, logistically, when you think about it, and I saw another really disturbing statistic coming out of the Australian Pain Foundation saying that up to 44% of people in Australia have been diagnosed with anxiety or depression, which is an extraordinary figure. And while there may be 6 or 8 or 10 sessions with a
That's right.
psychologist, I mean, there's not the workforce there to deal with the problem.
No, exactly. And a lot of this, I guess, comes down to the leader as well. And increasingly, there's a lot of pressure on leaders and managers, and I guess themselves finding it challenging to manage some of these issues. But we do know that the energy. This is some research again by Professor Kim Cameron out of University of Michigan, that the positive energy of the leader has an impact onto everybody in the team, and even back to their home environments as well. So I usually say no pressure, but if you're a leader, it's even more important that you're investing in your own well-being, and that you are trying to influence the organisation to create these flourishing workplaces for people to thrive in.
And we're going to get onto that because, but I think another thing I wanted to ask you before we kicked off
Yes.
talking about the positive side of this,
Yes.
what's potential is this new working from home has been
Yeah.
legitimised, hasn't it? And I mean, it used to be seen as a soft option. Oh, she wants to work. He wants to work from home. Oh,
That's
come on,
right.
that's skiving off. But it's been legitimised now. But that has kind of impact. I mean, there's some challenges, there's some positive. What are some of the challenges of working from home?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I just attended the Workplace Wellness Festival recently here in Sydney, and there was lots of conversation and debate about the pros and cons. From a psychological perspective, there are three core psychological needs that have been researched for decades that we know that if they're thwarted, so if we can't fulfill these needs, much again like if plants don't get sun, air, and water, it's the same analogy, then our well-being and our mental health suffers. So they're a sense of competence, a sense of autonomy, and a sense of relatedness, so positive relationships. But the autonomy piece, so what the flexible work environment has done is really equip, or really, I guess, fed into greater sense of autonomy, which is a great thing for our well-being. So flexible work practices, opportunity to sort of schedule your day as long as you're getting your work done. There's big ticks for autonomy. I think that some of the nuances around this too relate to some individual differences but also some environmental factors. So, for example, most people wouldn't know this, but I'm more of an introvert. Even though people think I'm an extrovert,
I
I really crave my time to myself. I grew up pretty much as an only child, so I spent a lot of time by myself. I quite like working from home, and I let my office go. I'm still here now working from home, but I guess I'm an extroverted introvert. So I am also craving to get out more and more, particularly hopefully as the weather warms up. But I think that some of the introverts really loved being at home, whereas the extroverts really wanted to get out, and that perhaps, and again, I can't quote any research on this, but then also the environment. So if you're in a home, and you're alone, and a lot of young people, like my son was 26, home by himself. He was with me for the first lockdown, and then he moved out into his own place by himself. And a lot of young people were in that situation. And we know the statistics. You're most at risk of developing a mental disorder under the age of 25. So I think a lot of young people couldn't wait to get back to the office if they were home alone, or if they were in shared places, and perhaps there was a lot of tension. And the same goes for those with young families, and perhaps if you were in a small space. So I think there are a lot of factors that affected whether you potentially flourished or didn't flourish working from home, and again leading to our choices now whether we want to be back in the workplace or not. I know a lot of the companies we work with, there's still quite some strict rules, and some of these are coming because they're global organizations, around returning to the office. So, and there was also this debate about the benefits to creating the energy and the positive workplace culture by having people in the workspace together. So because we know emotions are contagious, so there's a positive energy contagion by being near each other. And then there were also discussions around how do we continue to create inclusivity, which is a big issue in workplaces now when we've got hybrid working arrangements. And then, of course, we've got people like Elon Musk I think it was Elon Musk, wasn't it? Or that basically said everybody's back to
back in the
work.
office.
You know,
Yeah.
so so I
Hmm.
think it's an interesting time, but I really do think continuing to provide people with a level of autonomy because of what I quoted before, the research says is a good thing.
Hmm. Well, I don't want to defend Elon Musk, but I do know that as a dentist, it's very hard to work from home, and
Yes,
I imagine building cars is difficult unless you're all on the workforce. But it is
exactly.
interesting about the autonomy part of it, and but the legitimizing of it also. But this leads us into positive psychology and the PERMA model and how that translates into a workplace culture.
Yeah, interesting, Ron. Because when we look at particularly workplace mental health, there's a wonderful model. Again, this is based on some research by Professor down in Melbourne, Professor Anthony La Montagna, and I've been using this model a lot in my work. It's called the integrated approach to workplace mental health, and it's actually been picked up by the Victorian government. I'm aware of as well. So it says there are three, I guess, approaches to workplace mental health. One is to prevent harm. So that is assessing for and reducing psychosocial hazards, whether that's work overload, role clarity. There's a whole range of these hazards. So you need to assess and mitigate, reduce those hazards. And then the second one is to mitigate illness. So that is when people are, I guess, unwell, providing EAP, for example, or providing ways, whether it's rehabilitation or ways to help manage the illness once somebody has an illness. And then the third one, which brought a big smile to my face, was called promote positivity or promote flourishing, and that's the proactive arm. And of course, there's ways to do that at the individual, at the team, and at the organizational levels, or more simply, me, we, and us. So when we're looking at applying positive psychology in the workplace, we look at, well, firstly, education, because people don't know what they don't know. But then how can they apply what they've learned to themselves? And that's that personal responsibility. So if we use PERMA as a model, which is, as you know, Ron, positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, being these five foundations of a flourishing person or a flourishing life. So at the individual level, I'd be asking myself, what do I do on a daily or weekly or monthly basis to create more joy in my life? So I am experiencing these positive emotions. Engagement. Do I know what my strengths are, and am I using them regularly to build my levels of competence, and to also build a sense of meaning by using my strengths in service of others? R is relationships. So am I mindfully present, rather than multitasking and not being fully present with somebody? Am I building a high quality connection with someone? Am I validating their perspectives, even if I don't agree with them? And do people feel energized when they walk away from my interactions? That's relationships. Meaning, do I know what my values are, and am I actually living those values at work and in my life more generally? And sometimes people can make very small tweaks to live their values just a teensy weensy bit more, and I've seen well-being go up significantly. Just that awareness of what matters, and then making some small tweaks to living those values. Also, do I have a purpose? And some people don't tend to think about an overarching purpose of their lives, but at least some level of meaning and knowing what matters is important. And then accomplishment. So again, do I know, do I set some goals? And if you're not necessarily a goals person, do you know what gets you out of bed in the morning? And do you know what you want to accomplish? And are you getting a sense of competence? Are you making progress towards the things that matter to you in your life? So I ask myself that at an individual level. I would also encourage people to think about getting a coach if you've never had one, because it can really accelerate your goal striving and your well-being. Then at the team level, there's a wonderful opportunity for the leader to introduce, I guess, a model like PERMA, and then look at the team level, same sorts of questions. How are we building positive emotions? Does everybody know what their strengths are? How are we relating to each other? Do we use a coaching approach? Do we know what our purpose is? How does it align to the company vision and strategy? And are we, again, clear on our goals and getting a sense of competence? So again, there's many, many different strategies and initiatives you can use. And then finally, at an organizational level, do our systems, our policies and procedures, do they all align, I guess, to theories like self-determination theory? Are they building competence? Do they give people a sense of autonomy? Do they help create positive relationships? So it's taking a much broader lens at, as I said, systems, policies, procedures, and are they in alignment with what we know from positive psychology will lead to enhanced levels of well-being and reduced levels of mental illness. So it's a big job. It's organizational development and organizational change, and anyone working in that field will tell you that's the long game, and it's not something that you start here and you get there and you finish. It's an ongoing. How do we keep this culture positive and flourishing, as particularly through people's life journey from onboarding, through developing right through to perhaps outplacement or retirement. It's the whole life cycle of an employee.
Do you know, it's funny, as you're speaking and you're saying it's an ongoing thing, I think one of the things I've observed in my life, and I know this is with my wife too, is that as a male, we are often very solutions focused. Like, we've dealt with that issue, we've done that. Yes, we dealt with workplace health last year, it's been done. And
Yes.
whereas women tend to see it as a more ongoing conversation, a continuous process. And I wonder where, if we saw more women in charge of companies, we would see perhaps it is a, I hate to stereotype.
Yeah, yeah, they are broad gender generalizations. I know we have to be mindful of that, but
Yep.
I do, mind you, I'm a bit like solution focused too, Rod. So I like to, set a goal, achieve it, be solution focused. But yeah, sometimes it is important to sit, as you know, and increasingly in psychology more generally, we're being encouraged to sit with the discomfort, and even from a coaching perspective. Often people want to rush to a new job or a new relationship, and part of coaching is helping people to sit with the discomfort as we systematically look at the different pathways that might be available. How do they align to my values? How do they leverage my strengths? So there is a tendency, because most of us don't like the discomfort or the anxiety with not taking action, but there's real benefit in sometimes sitting. And I think there's real wisdom in taking that approach as well.
Mm. It's interesting too that you mentioned defining three parts to burnout as including disengagement and ineffectiveness, or
Yeah.
feeling there's meaning and accomplishment. I mean, the PERMA approach ticks so
It's
many boxes in this. The positive, it's a really great structure, isn't it, to approach
it,
these issues?
It absolutely is. And of course, there are many I would say, pathways to PERMA. There's lots of, so PERMA, if we look at it, as I said, as the foundations of a flourishing life, but there are lots of pathways, for example, lots of pathways to build positive emotions, and I guess the types of activities that one person might engage in to build positive emotions might be different from the pathways that another person, utilizes to build positive emotions. But it really comes down to, I guess, self-awareness. um, and and even yesterday I was having a discussion with someone, a client I'm about to work with, and he said, it's people have, what did he say, it's common sense, but not common practice. And I think,
Interesting.
even in physical health and nutrition, I worked in a dietitian's office when I first finished my doctorate. I worked there for, I think, 12 or 18 months, and I had person after person coming in saying to me, I could be a dietitian, Susie. I know what I'm meant to be doing. I'm just not doing it. And I think we're at the same point now psychologically. We're at a point where we can prescribe activities that we know and research supports can boost our psychological well-being. But that gap between knowing and doing is a challenging one, which is why, again, I think, coaching in its very many forms, it doesn't have to be professional, expensive. It can just be even a coaching conversation with a colleague, or, is really the secret sauce in translating knowledge into action.
I was going to ask what some of the challenges are, and that is one. I mean, you've dealt with companies, and
Yes.
you come with this wonderful model that, if only they would embrace it. What are some of the challenges there? What's the blockage?
To embracing, I guess, more of a positive
Yeah,
approach. I think, historically it was seen as a bit fluffy or a bit Pollyanna-ish. But yeah, the research, I mean, I know I had a lot of people used to look to me like Pollyanna before, but it's very hard to argue with the research now. And when you have organizations like Accenture, who we've worked here with for, this is our fifth year working with them on leadership development program, which is based on the science of positive psychology and positive organizational scholarship. We work with large global pharmaceutical companies, a range of companies in all industries, really. Construction, we're working with a wonderful medium-sized construction company here in Australia, who I had gone along and spoken to a group of CEOs, and this CEO completely understood it. And I can tell you, not everybody in the room did, but he could absolutely see that there was a duty of care from an health and safety perspective. But he also could see that that was what was going to attract and retain people, and they wanted to have a positive workplace culture. And he realized they were doing many wonderful things, which many companies are doing, lots of wonderful things. But I think what positive psych and POSIL scholarship does is it brings the scientific underpinnings, and it provides frameworks so you can see how all of the initiatives actually connect to the science. And in fact, that's what we do when we work with schools and when we work with organizations, is to firstly map out all the different initiatives, perhaps even using PERMA as a model. Like, what are you doing already to build positive emotions, engagement, blah blah blah. So yeah, just I think it provides a wonderful framework. So I think, yeah, a lack of understanding of what it is, and so education is really important for people to know that there is very hard, rigorous science supporting everything that we present from an education perspective. And I think, time. Everyone's just so busy, aren't they? And that was that comment before. It's common sense, but not common practice.
Practice.
And I did write a blog on LinkedIn earlier this year, which I called Wellbeing Information Overload. And it was like when COVID hit, it was, the companies were just throwing information, putting it on intranets, sending out emails. But overwhelmingly, people would say, but we don't have time to even reflect on this, let alone read it. So if you're going to provide people with education and resources and initiatives, you also need to provide some space to personalize it, to contextualize it, because otherwise it's such a waste of time and money. And,
Mm.
and we're not really creating the environments that we're aiming to create.
So when you come into a company and you get buy-in from a
Yes.
CEO, how do you
Yes.
assess success? How do you measure success?
There's a range of, I guess, metrics that you can use. In saying that, it's not always easy. I'm always really hard upfront about we want metrics, but I can tell you time and time again, it's been very, very difficult for us to enact that for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the company will say, people fill out enough questionnaires as it is. We don't want any more metrics. We know this works. We don't feel that we need to show the metrics, which makes it hard for us, because when we go to another company, we want to take the metrics. And that's been my whole background, has been in, assessing well-being and well-being outcomes. But you can use, we can sometimes create our own, I guess, survey based on some validated psychometric measures, like well-being measures, like strengths knowledge, strengths use, flow, how often people are in flow. So sometimes we can create our own. There are some existing well-being measures on the market now, technologies, platforms. There's a number of tech platforms that have well-being assessments now. So there are ways to do it. And then you can also look at existing internal metrics like absenteeism, the whole range of other promotion. So pre-existing metrics that you can also look at. But of course, can you say it's just down to your program when there are so many variables that happen in a workplace? So it gets very messy and slippery sometimes to do this real world research.
Hmm. But Susie, providing a structure like you do at the Positivity Institute and the work that you do is almost a no-brainer to any thinking CEO or HR person, I can only imagine. And in schools too, this must be an exciting new area to be working in.
Yeah, it's wonderful. In many ways, schools are ahead of organisations, I would argue. Not all schools, but this field of positive education, which launched about 2008, 2009, when Geelong Grammar first brought Marty Seligman out.
Hmm.
Uh, we it took a little bit of a hit through COVID. We had so many cancellations and postponements. And as you know, the schools suffered, probably one of the professions or industries that suffered the most through COVID, particularly teachers and anyone working in a school, and of course the students. But it's wonderful to see. We've just run 2 programs down in South Australia just in the last week. So schools are starting to re-engage again with education. And we have our Positive Education Schools Association conference coming up at Ravenswood here in October, I think it is. So I think we're going to start to see a re-emergence of that. But I also wanted to, just while I think about it, at the same time, Marty Seligman published this seminal paper on positive education, which was 2009, there was another paper he published on positive health. And I think it was the same year. And because PosEd really just took off, nothing much happened in the pos health field. But I'm really excited to tell you that we're really starting to see some movement in that field. I think it's the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland now have a Masters of Health Coaching and a diploma in positive health that my colleague, Professor Christian van Nieuwburg, is running over in Ireland. And we've also just started work here with Intensive Care New South Wales. So we just held a wellbeing summit with 100 people about 3 weeks ago, starting to explore what are the factors. And again, we're very mindful to acknowledge that clearly there are workplace factors that impact on healthcare workers, and that's a big part of the pie. But again, looking to some of the existing initiatives, and there's some wonderful initiatives already existing across the state, and then also looking to what else we can do in terms of education and coaching and other support to support staff in intensive care.
I know that you mentioned he's talked about positive health because whenever we reference it in our program, we always use the PERMA, PERMA, H.
That's it.
H.
Absolutely.
And because I think he kind of came to the point where he thought, yes, it's good to have all those 5 things, but to have good health facilitates those first 5 things, makes them more achievable, or at least. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're strongly connected. As you would know, sometimes we see PERMA V, and V's for vitality as well. So,
okay.
So yeah, there is increasing interest in this area of positive health, which I would say watch this space. It's very exciting.
Well, Suzy, what a note to finish on. And thank you again. Always so great to catch up. And I love everything that the Positivity Institute and you are doing. Keep going.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you again today and the wonderful work that you always do.
Now, I always come away talking to Suzy Green, feeling positive, feeling uplifted, feeling, well, her mission is to create a flourishing world, and she certainly has that impact on me whenever I talk to her, and I hope that has inspired you as well. I just love her approach, and we will, of course, have links to the Positivity Institute, Suzy's work, and her book, of course. So I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.